It was Tuesday, March 4th, 11:37 a.m., and the courtroom was eerily quiet. Everyone sat stiffly on the hard benches as the sound of shuffling papers filled the space. Judge Robert Whitman, a grizzled man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a reputation for being tough but fair, leaned back in his chair. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the young girl standing in front of him. Her name was Kayla Thompson, just 17 years old, with skin the color of rich mahogany and thick, coiled hair pulled back into a neat bun. She stood there in an oversized hoodie, clutching her hands together, her eyes calm yet resolute. The courtroom's air was thick with tension, but Kayla stood steady. "What do you have to say for yourself?" the judge asked with a smirk, glancing at the courtroom like he was already expecting this to be the highlight of his day. The case wasn't serious. A misdemeanor, some misunderstanding about shoplifting. But Judge Whitman didn't seem to care. He looked Kayla up and down, his gaze dripping with condescension. He wasn't used to kids like her, sharp, confident, and unwilling to wilt under his gaze. Kayla's public defender, Mr. Harrison, stood beside her, clutching his briefcase as though his life depended on it. But it was clear he wasn't exactly brimming with energy to defend her. Kayla didn't flinch when the judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "It's funny, isn't it? Someone like you, someone from your neighborhood, thinking you could outsmart the system." The room went silent. You could hear the creak of someone shifting in their seat and the faint hum of the old courthouse's fluorescent lights. And then it happened. Kayla tilted her head, locked eyes with the judge, and said, with a calm voice, "Do you know who I am?" The judge chuckled, a low, rumbling laugh that made even the stenographer glance nervously at the bench. "Enlighten me, young lady," he said, leaning back in his chair like he'd heard every excuse in the book. "This should be good." Kayla's next words made the entire room freeze. "I'm not just some teenager from the wrong side of town. My name is Kayla Thompson, and I'm the daughter of your colleague, Judge Angela Thompson." Whitman's smile evaporated like smoke. The courtroom gasped, murmurs breaking out like a wave rippling through the benches. Judge Whitman's face turned an alarming shade of red as Kayla stood there, shoulders back, staring him down like she had just flipped the entire courtroom on its head. Judge laughs at black teenager in court, shocked when she exposes the truth about herself. The judge fumbled with his gavel, as if he were trying to regain control of the room, but it was too late. The air was electric, crackling with the realization that he had not only underestimated Kayla, but had also possibly insulted the daughter of someone in his own circle. And now, everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. But before Whitman could say a word, Kayla spoke again. "Shall I explain why I'm here today? Or would you like to continue making assumptions?" The entire courtroom leaned in, breathless. Just a few months earlier, Kayla had been an ordinary high school junior living with her mom in Atlanta. She was smart, straight-A smart, and had big dreams of going to law school. But life in her neighborhood wasn't easy. Her mom, Judge Angela Thompson, worked long hours, often leaving Kayla to fend for herself. Angela had always taught her daughter to stand up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. It all started at a local corner store not far from Kayla's school. She'd gone in to buy a pack of gum and a bottle of water, but when she got to the counter, the cashier, a grumpy older man named Mr. Wilson, accused her of stealing. "I saw you put something in your bag," he barked, pointing a crooked finger at her. Kayla was stunned. She opened her bag to show him it was empty except for her school books, but he wasn't having it. "Don't lie to me, girl," he snapped, picking up the phone to call the police. "You kids are all the same." By the time the officers arrived, Mr. Wilson had already painted Kayla as a troublemaker. The store's cameras were conveniently broken, and despite Kayla's protests, she was taken into custody. Her mom, furious and humiliated, had to bail her out that evening. Angela tried to resolve things quietly, but the store owner refused to drop the charges, insisting he'd seen what he saw. And now here they were, back in the courtroom. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, but no words came out. The smug confidence he'd had just moments before was gone. Kayla wasn't going to let him off the hook, though, not after what he'd said. "So," Kayla said, her voice steady, "are you going to hear my side of the story, or are you going to keep judging me before I speak?" The judge's face twitched. The room was dead silent. The courtroom door creaked loudly as it swung open, cutting through the tense silence like a knife. All eyes turned to see who had just entered. The figure that stepped in made the room collectively gasp. It was Judge Angela Thompson herself, dressed in a sleek gray suit. Her expression was a mix of calm authority and barely contained fury. She didn't rush, taking her time to walk confidently toward the front of the room. Every step echoed loudly against the polished wooden floors, as if announcing her arrival to everyone in the building. Her piercing eyes locked onto Judge Whitman, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Angela," Whitman sputtered, attempting a weak smile. "I wasn't expecting." "That much is clear," she interrupted, her tone icy but composed. "I didn't come here to sit silently while you humiliate my daughter." The murmurs started up again, and a bailiff had to call for order. Angela's presence was commanding, and even those who didn't know her immediately understood she was someone important. Kayla stood rooted to her spot, her heart racing. Her mother hadn't told her she was coming, and now the entire room felt like a stage with Angela as the main act. Whitman leaned back in his chair, fumbling for words. "This is highly irregular. I'm not sure it's appropriate." "Appropriate?" Angela's sharp laugh cut him off. "You think it's appropriate to mock a teenager in open court? To reduce her to a stereotype without even bothering to hear her out? I think we've moved well past what's appropriate, don't you?" Whitman's face flushed red again, but this time it wasn't from anger. He glanced toward the clerk, as though searching for some kind of escape, but there was none. Angela wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. She turned to Kayla, her expression softening for the first time since she walked in. "Kayla," she said gently, "tell them exactly what happened. And don't leave out a single detail." Kayla hesitated for just a moment, but then she nodded. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and turned to face the room. "Like I said, I was in the store to buy gum and water. I didn't take anything. I even offered to let him check my bag, but Mr. Wilson wasn't interested in the truth. He just saw me and assumed I was a thief." Her voice was steady, but there was a noticeable tremble in her hands as she clenched her fists at her sides. "The cameras in the store weren't even working, and there's no evidence that I did anything wrong. But somehow, I'm the one standing here in court." She glanced at Whitman, her expression firm. "And now you're laughing at me like I'm just some joke to you." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Even Judge Whitman couldn't look her in the eye. Angela stepped forward, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Your Honor," she said, her voice laced with barely concealed anger, "this isn't just about my daughter. This is about the systemic bias that kids like her face every single day. You don't get to dismiss her experience just because of where she's from or how she looks. I won't allow it." Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but Angela raised a hand to stop him. "No, Robert. You've already said enough. Now you're going to listen." Months before the trial, the corner store incident had been a whirlwind for Kayla and her mom. Angela had fought tooth and nail to get the charges dropped, but Mr. Wilson was stubborn, claiming he had seen it with his own eyes. It didn't matter that he had no proof or that Kayla had a spotless record. He was determined to make an example of her. Angela tried everything: phone calls, meetings, even visiting the store herself to confront Wilson, but nothing worked. Wilson's bias ran too deep. And so, the case moved forward, dragging Kayla into a legal battle she never should have been part of. At school, the story spread fast. Some of Kayla's classmates believed her, while others whispered behind her back. "She probably did it," they said. "She's just good at hiding it." It was infuriating, but Kayla refused to let it break her. If anything, it made her more determined to fight. Angela, on the other hand, was furious, not just at Wilson, but at the entire system. As a judge, she had seen this kind of thing too many times before. Kids like Kayla were treated as guilty until proven innocent, and she wasn't about to let her daughter become another statistic. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Angela's words had hit a nerve, and it was clear he was struggling to maintain his composure. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a routine hearing had turned into a public reckoning. But then, something unexpected happened. The courtroom door opened again, and this time, it was Mr. Wilson himself. The store owner looked nervous, his hat clutched in his hands as he shuffled toward the front of the room. "What are you doing here?" Angela demanded, her eyes narrowing. Wilson cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze. I think there's been a mistake." The room erupted into chaos, with everyone talking at once. Judge Whitman banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. Angela stared at Wilson, her disbelief written all over her face. Kayla, meanwhile, felt a surge of hope and confusion. What was going on? Why was Wilson suddenly here? And what did he mean by a mistake? The courtroom fell silent again as Mr. Wilson stood at the front, wringing his hat in his hands. He avoided looking at Kayla, Angela, or Judge Whitman. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. "Mr. Wilson," Angela said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "If you have something to say, you'd better say it now." Wilson cleared his throat, his voice shaky. I made a mistake," he mumbled, his words barely audible. I didn't see her take anything." The room gasped. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment to glance up, wide-eyed. Angela crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "What do you mean by a mistake?" Judge Whitman asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and irritation. He wasn't exactly thrilled about the direction this was going, especially with Angela Thompson staring daggers at him from across the room. Wilson fumbled with his words. I assumed she took something," he stammered, glancing nervously at Kayla. "There were some kids in the store earlier, messing around, and when I saw her, I just thought." Kayla's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You thought I was just like them, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You didn't even give me a chance." Wilson's face flushed, and he muttered, "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Angela's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You dragged my daughter through the mud. You had her arrested. You made her a target of humiliation at school. And now, after all of that, all you can say is sorry?" Wilson looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he mumbled. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Angela snapped. The right thing would have been to check the facts before accusing a child of a crime she didn't commit. Judge Whitman banged his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" His face was bright red, and his frustration was palpable. He clearly didn't want this spiraling any further out of his control. Angela turned to him, her expression steely. "No, Robert. You don't get to brush this under the rug. Not this time. You laughed at my daughter. You treated her like a stereotype, not a human being. And now we find out the entire case was built on nothing but assumptions." Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mrs. Thompson, Judge Thompson," she corrected, her voice cold. "And don't you dare try to lecture me about courtroom decorum when you've already violated it by mocking my daughter." The room was dead silent again, everyone holding their breath as Angela stared down Whitman. Even Kayla was stunned into silence, watching her mom take command of the room with a ferocity she'd never seen before. Months before the confession, after Kayla's arrest, Angela had spent countless sleepless nights poring over case files and researching similar incidents. She'd seen firsthand how biases in the justice system disproportionately targeted kids like Kayla. Black kids, kids from working-class neighborhoods, kids who didn't fit the mold of what society deemed respectable. And as much as she wanted to believe her colleagues would handle the case fairly, deep down, she knew better. Kayla, meanwhile, had thrown herself into her schoolwork, determined to prove that she was more than the accusations against her. But the whispers at school didn't stop, and every time she walked into a room, it felt like people were staring at her, judging her, deciding who she was without even knowing her. It was Angela's idea to subpoena the store's surveillance footage, hoping that even broken cameras might hold some clues. But when they reviewed the footage, they found nothing. The cameras had indeed been out of service. Still, Angela refused to give up. She dug deeper, questioning witnesses and pressing the prosecutor's office to investigate Mr. Wilson's claims more thoroughly. And then, the night before the court date, she got an unexpected call. It was Mr. Wilson. He sounded nervous, his voice trembling as he admitted that he might have made a mistake. He didn't outright confess to lying, but Angela could tell he was hiding something. When she asked why he was coming forward now, he mumbled something about not wanting to ruin a kid's life and hung up. Angela hadn't told Kayla about the call, unsure of how things would play out in court. But now, as Wilson stood in front of the entire room confessing his mistake, Angela felt a mix of anger and vindication. Back in the courtroom, "Mr. Wilson," Whitman said, his voice strained, "are you now saying that your original statement to the police was false?" Wilson nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched his hat. "Yes, Your Honor. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was wrong." Angela stepped forward, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I move to have the charges against my daughter dismissed immediately. There is no evidence to support them, and the key witness has just admitted he lied." Whitman hesitated, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He glanced at Kayla, then Angela, and finally at Wilson. For a moment, it looked like he might push back, but then he sighed heavily. "I'll take it under advisement," he said grudgingly. "But this is highly irregular." Angela raised an eyebrow. "What's irregular is how this case was handled from the start." Before Whitman could respond, Kayla spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "I just want to know one thing," she said, looking directly at Wilson. "Why did you do it? Why did you accuse me?" Wilson hesitated, shifting nervously. I don't know. You look suspicious. And after those other kids came in," Kayla's eyes narrowed. "You mean I look black?" The room erupted into murmurs again, and Whitman banged his gavel. But Kayla wasn't done. "People like you see kids like me and assume the worst," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You don't see our dreams, our hard work, or who we really are. All you see is a stereotype." Wilson looked like he might cry, but Kayla didn't care. She turned back to Whitman, her gaze steady. "And you laughed at me because you thought I didn't matter. But I do, and I won't let any of you forget that." All heads turned as the voice cut through the tension in the courtroom. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and a crisp navy blue suit stepped forward. He exuded confidence, the kind that made people automatically assume he was someone important. And they weren't wrong. "I'm Detective James Carter," he announced, holding up his badge. "I've been investigating this case, and I have some critical information that I think the court should hear." Angela stiffened. She had heard of Detective Carter before. He was known for being meticulous, but also for playing by his own rules. She wasn't sure whether his sudden appearance was a blessing or a potential derailment. Kayla glanced nervously at her mom, unsure of what was happening. "Detective Carter," Judge Whitman said, squinting at him, "this is highly unusual. Do you have evidence relevant to this case?" "More than relevant, Your Honor," Carter replied, stepping forward with a manila folder in hand. He handed it to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. "I believe this will explain everything." Whitman opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the contents. After a few moments, he looked up at Carter, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What is this?" he asked. "Explain yourself." Carter turned to face the courtroom, his voice steady. "I took it upon myself to look into Mr. Wilson's store after hearing about this case. What I found was concerning, to say the least. The security cameras weren't just broken, they were deliberately disabled." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Wilson shifted uncomfortably, his face turning pale. "And that's not all," Carter continued. "Mr. Wilson has a pattern of making false accusations against teenagers, specifically black teenagers. I pulled police reports from the past 3 years. There were 5 other incidents just like this one, all involving young black kids who were accused of shoplifting, and all charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence." Angela's jaw tightened, and Kayla's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't just about her. It was a pattern, a deliberate targeting of kids like her. "Objection!" Whitman sputtered, his voice rising. "Detective Carter, this is hearsay, unless you have concrete evidence." "Oh, I do," Carter interrupted, pulling out a USB drive from his pocket. "I managed to recover partial footage from the store security system. It took some digging, but the footage shows Kayla clearly at the counter, paying for her items. She didn't take a single thing." The room erupted into chaos. People whispered furiously to one another, and Mr. Wilson looked like he might pass out. Whitman banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, But even his booming voice couldn't calm the storm of emotions in the room. Weeks earlier, Detective Carter had been assigned a different case when he first heard about Kayla's situation. A friend of Angela's had reached out to him, concerned about the fairness of the proceedings. Carter didn't have to get involved. Technically, it wasn't his case, but something about it didn't sit right with him. He decided to dig deeper. His investigation uncovered a troubling pattern at Mr. Wilson's store. The cameras had been broken during each alleged incident, and Wilson had a habit of targeting kids from the nearby predominantly black high school. Carter knew he couldn't let it slide, so he worked late nights to piece together enough evidence to expose the truth. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his face grim. The room had quieted down, but the tension was palpable. He stared at the USB drive in Carter's hand, then at Mr. Wilson, who was now visibly sweating. "Mr. Wilson," Whitman said, his voice cold, "do you have an explanation for any of this?" Wilson stammered, I didn't mean I thought. "You thought no one would notice," Angela said, cutting him off. Her voice was steady, but her anger was clear. "You thought you could keep doing this without consequences. But not this time." Whitman glanced at the folder again, then at Angela. "Detective Carter, I'll review the evidence, but—" "There's nothing to review, Your Honor," Angela said firmly. "You've seen enough. The charges against my daughter should be dismissed immediately." Whitman hesitated, his face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. It was clear he didn't like being backed into a corner, but there was no way out. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Very well. The charges against Kayla Thompson are dismissed. Case closed." Kayla let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Angela placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but the moment was bittersweet. While they had won, the fight had exposed just how deep the biases ran. But before anyone could celebrate, Carter spoke again. "One more thing, Your Honor," he said. "I'm officially recommending that Mr. Wilson be investigated for filing false police reports. And based on what I've found, I believe the court should consider criminal charges." The room erupted again, with gasps and murmurs filling the air. Mr. Wilson looked like he might faint. Whitman banged his gavel, but this time, even he seemed rattled. The courtroom door creaked open again, and the figure who stepped in seemed to carry a weight that silenced the room instantly. A tall woman with striking features, dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit, strode confidently to the front. Her presence demanded attention. Her sharp eyes scanned the room as though she already knew everything that had transpired. Angela's face was a mix of recognition and irritation, her lips pressed into a thin line. Kayla glanced at her mom, confused. "Who is that?" she whispered. "That's Meredith Wallace," Angela said quietly, her voice taut with barely contained frustration. "The state attorney?" Kayla blinked. "The state attorney? What's she doing here?" Angela didn't answer, but her jaw tightened as Meredith reached the front of the room and nodded curtly at Judge Whitman. "Your Honor," Meredith began, her tone clipped and formal, "I've just been briefed on the developments in this case. While I agree with the dismissal of charges against Miss Thompson, I have serious concerns about the broader implications of what's come to light." Whitman frowned. "Ms. Wallace, this case is effectively closed." "Not yet, it's not," Meredith replied, her tone firm. Detective Carter's findings raise questions about more than just this single incident. If Mr. Wilson has been targeting children from certain backgrounds and filing false reports, that's not just misconduct, it's criminal behavior. And it's something the state intends to investigate thoroughly. The room buzzed with murmurs again, but Meredith wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her eyes narrowing, "I'd like to address the conduct of this courtroom." Whitman stiffened. "What exactly are you implying?" Meredith's gaze was ice cold. "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm stating outright that the behavior exhibited here today, mocking a teenager, dismissing her as though her voice didn't matter, is unacceptable. This isn't just about Mr. Wilson's prejudice. It's about how our justice system allows biases to go unchecked." Angela crossed her arms, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She clearly wasn't a fan of Meredith Wallace, but in this moment, the state attorney was saying what Angela had been thinking all along. The weeks leading up to this moment, behind the scenes, Meredith had been following cases like Kayla's for years. Reports of false accusations and racially biased arrests weren't new to her, but they were often brushed aside as isolated incidents. When Angela had reached out to her office months earlier, Meredith had dismissed it as another minor case. But as more evidence came to light, her interest had grown. When she got the call about today's courtroom drama, she dropped everything to attend. Not because she wanted to help Angela. There was no love lost between them, but because this case had the potential to expose systemic issues that couldn't be ignored. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard by Meredith's directness. "Ms. Wallace, this is not the appropriate venue for a discussion about systemic reform." "On the contrary," Meredith shot back, "this is exactly the venue. If this courtroom can't uphold justice for all, then it's not doing its job. And as the state attorney, it's my job to ensure that changes." Kayla watched the exchange with wide eyes. For the first time, she felt like the weight of what had happened to her was being acknowledged, not just as a mistake, but as part of a much larger problem. Meredith turned to Angela, her expression softening slightly. "Judge Thompson," she said, "you've been fighting this battle for years. I think it's time we fought it together." Angela's eyes narrowed. She didn't trust Meredith, not entirely. But for the sake of her daughter, and every kid like her, she nodded. "I'm willing to hear you out." Meredith returned the nod, then addressed the room again. "Detective Carter, I'll be working with you to ensure a full investigation into Mr. Wilson's actions. In your honor, I trust you'll cooperate fully with our efforts." Whitman looked like he wanted to argue, but instead, he sighed heavily. "Very well. Do what you must." Meredith turned to Kayla, her tone softening. "Miss Thompson, I owe you an apology. The system failed you, and that's something we can't undo. But I promise you this. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Kayla blinked back tears, unsure of what to say. Angela squeezed her shoulder gently, a silent reminder that she didn't have to carry this alone. As the courtroom began to clear, Angela pulled Meredith aside. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not interested in empty promises or political games. If we're doing this, it's for real." Meredith nodded. "Agreed. But make no mistake, this isn't going to be easy. If we're going to challenge the system, we'll be stepping on a lot of toes." Angela smirked. "Good. It's about time." Meanwhile, Kayla sat quietly, watching the two women talk. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for every kid who'd ever been underestimated, dismissed, or unfairly judged. But just as she allowed herself to relax, Detective Carter approached her with a serious expression. "Kayla," he said, "there's something else you need to know." She tensed. "What is it?" "It's about Mr. Wilson," Carter said. "I think he's just the tip of the iceberg." Kayla's heart raced as Detective Carter's words sank in. "Someone bigger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Carter looked around cautiously, his tone low and urgent. "Mr. Wilson isn't just a store owner with a bias problem. He's part of a network, people in this area who've been quietly working to push out certain communities. They use accusations like this to intimidate and discourage families from staying here." Kayla's eyes widened. "Are you saying this was on purpose? They wanted me to get arrested?" Carter nodded grimly. "Wilson might have been the one pointing the finger, but he's not the mastermind. I've seen evidence of similar cases all over the city. Falsified reports, fake witnesses, and so-called broken security cameras. It's all too organized to be a coincidence." Angela, who had been listening intently, stepped in. "If this is true, then we're dealing with something much bigger than just one store owner," she said, her voice steely. "We need proof. Solid proof." Carter reached into his coat pocket and handed Angela a small envelope. "I've been gathering evidence, but I couldn't take it to anyone until now. You're the only one I trust to handle this the right way." Angela opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs and documents. There were surveillance images of Wilson meeting with other local business owners, maps marking certain neighborhoods, and handwritten notes with phrases like "increase police presence" and "target problematic areas." "This is a coordinated effort," Angela said, her voice thick with anger. "They're targeting minority communities and using false accusations to make them feel unsafe. Kayla's stomach churned. Why would they do that? To drive up property values, Carter said bluntly. Push families out, bring in developers, and turn the neighborhood into something respectable. It's gentrification, but with a much uglier, deliberate edge. Angela and Carter wasted no time. They began reaching out to families who had been affected, gathering testimonies and digging deeper into the web of corruption. What they found was both infuriating and heartbreaking. Dozens of cases where innocent kids had been accused of crimes, all in an effort to intimidate their families into moving away. Kayla became more than just a victim. She became a symbol. Her story was shared across social media, sparking outrage and drawing attention to the issue. Local news stations picked up the story, and protests began forming outside Wilson's store and other businesses suspected of being part of the scheme. But with the attention came danger. Angela received anonymous threats warning her to drop the case. Carter's car was vandalized, and Kayla began noticing strangers watching her at school and in the neighborhood. It was clear that whoever was behind this wouldn't go down without a fight. Back in court, a month later, Angela, Kayla, and Carter found themselves back in the same courthouse, but this time, it wasn't Kayla on trial. Mr. Wilson and 3 other local business owners were facing charges of conspiracy, filing false police reports, and violating civil rights. The courtroom was packed, with reporters lining the back rows and protesters chanting outside. Meredith Wallace stood at the prosecution table, delivering her opening statement. "This case is about more than just a few bad actors," she said. "It's about exposing a system designed to oppress and intimidate the very people it claims to protect." Kayla sat next to her mom, clutching Angela's hand tightly. She felt a mix of fear and determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure no one else went through what she had. As the trial unfolded, more evidence came to light, painting a damning picture of the conspiracy. But just when it seemed like they had everything under control, a bombshell revelation threatened to derail everything. One of the defense attorneys stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, "we have evidence that suggests Detective Carter may have violated protocol during his investigation." Angela's heart sank. She turned to Carter, who looked momentarily stunned, but quickly regained his composure. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "Everything I did was by the book." The defense attorney smirked. "We'll let the court decide that." For a moment, the room felt like it was spiraling out of control. If the defense could discredit Carter, the entire case might fall apart. Kayla felt panic rising in her chest, but Angela squeezed her hand tightly. "Don't worry," Angela whispered. "We've come too far to let them win." Over the next few days, the trial became a battle of wits. The defense tried to poke holes in Carter's credibility, but Angela and Meredith fought back with everything they had. Witnesses came forward to testify about the intimidation they had faced, and Carter's evidence held up under scrutiny. Finally, after weeks of tense proceedings, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted into cheers, and Kayla felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged her mom. But the victory was bittersweet. While justice had been served, Kayla knew the fight wasn't over. There were still more communities facing the same struggles, and she was determined to keep fighting. For herself, for her family, and for everyone who had been silenced for too long. In the months that followed, Kayla became a leading voice for change in her community. She spoke at schools, rallies, and even city council meetings, sharing her story and advocating for reforms to the justice system. Angela and Meredith formed an unlikely alliance, working together to push for policy changes that would prevent similar abuses of power. And as for Mr. Wilson, he lost his store, his reputation, and his freedom. Kayla's journey wasn't easy, but she had proven one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't silence her voice.